Sarah had always been drawn to old places, believing they held stories etched into their walls. So, when she found a charming apartment in a historic building downtown, she couldn't resist. It was perfect. High ceilings, vintage fixtures, and large windows that bathed the rooms in golden sunlight. It felt like a place with character, a place she could call home. The first night was quiet. Sarah unpacked her belongings and arranged her furniture. By the time she went to bed, exhaustion from the move had her asleep almost instantly. But at 2:47 a.m., she woke to a sound. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to be unsettling. A soft, continuous whisper. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding. She strained to listen, but the sound stopped. She told herself it was probably the old pipes or the wind outside and went back to sleep. The next morning, she mentioned the noise to her neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, a frail woman in her late 70s who had lived in the building for over 40 years. "Oh, you heard them," Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah frowned. "Heard what?" "The shadows," Mrs. Whitaker replied, her eyes darting around as if afraid to say more. "They whisper to you when they like you. They only scream when they don't." Sarah laughed nervously, brushing off the old woman's cryptic words as superstition or senility. But that night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder and more distinct. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the urgency in them, like someone was desperately trying to communicate. She turned on every light in the apartment, searching for the source. The whispers seemed to follow her, louder near the corner of her living room, where the shadows from her floor lamp stretched unnaturally long. "Hello?" she said aloud, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the corner. The shadows seemed to shift slightly, but she convinced herself it was just her imagination. The next few days were uneventful. Sarah began to think she'd overreacted. But on the fifth night, everything changed. She woke again at 2:47 a.m., this time to a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the walls. She followed the noise, which led her to the same corner of the living room. Her breath hitched as she noticed the shadows moving, slowly, deliberately, as if they were alive. Panicked, Sarah grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Julie. "You're just tired," Julie said. "Moving is stressful. Take a sleeping pill and get some rest." Sarah tried to follow her advice, but as she lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The next morning, Sarah decided to do some research. She visited the local library and combed through old records about her building. What she found sent chills down her spine. Decades ago, a young woman named Eleanor had lived in her apartment. Eleanor was found dead under mysterious circumstances, her body discovered in the same corner of the living room where Sarah had heard the whispers. The death was ruled a suicide, but neighbors at the time reported hearing screams and strange noises for weeks leading up to her death. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipe set her on edge. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the whispers began again, louder than ever. This time, Sarah decided she couldn't ignore them. Armed with a flashlight, she approached the corner of the living room. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, the shadows began to shift. They peeled away from the walls, gathering in the corner like smoke. Slowly, they formed a dark, amorphous figure with two glowing eyes. Sarah stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, but the glowing eyes remained, locked onto hers. The whispers turned into a low growl. The figure lunged toward her, and Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet and running for the door. She fumbled with the lock, her hands trembling, but when she turned the knob, the door wouldn't budge. The growling grew louder, and Sarah felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned around, but the figure was gone. The room was empty. The next morning, Sarah packed her belongings and left the apartment. She didn't tell anyone the full story, only that she couldn't live there anymore. But even in her new apartment, Sarah sometimes hears faint whispers at night. They start softly, almost imperceptibly, but they always grow louder. And every time she looks at the shadows in the corners of her new home, she can't shake the feeling that they're watching her. The shadows, it seems, have followed her,